Limestone Way. Limestone Way is a small road, its length no more than 2 miles, set winding through country expanse which is, though beautiful, quite commonplace for the wooded hills and rolling pastures of Kentucky. It sits several miles out from the nearest town, and though the sides brush lightly against cow pens and creeks, it hosts many stately homes, constructs whose looming silhouettes make the term manor seem more appropriate than anything the word house can convey. The sparse and spacious beauty of the area around them was what drew the county's wealthier residents out this far, just as it had driven them to build these manors on large and sprawling lots whose edges were lined with obstructive privacy rows of venerable old trees. They made ample use of this space, and there was a comfortable measure of distance between neighbors here on this white-collar island, amongst the farms of the surrounding countryside. This was also what drew Bud out to Limestone Way, a road upon which he did not live, at 3 in the morning, to gaze up the grassy yards towards the taunting lights of the homes off the left side of the lane. The road itself was empty, and there hadn't been any traffic in over an hour. His car, parked in the turnoff of a pasture about a quarter mile up the way, was shielded from the views of any potential late-night drivers. Bud was more than ready for a night at work, and after several nights of cautious observation, he felt certain he could make $1 or $2 on the houses along Limestone Way. He yanked a balaclava down to cover his features, feeling for all the world like a cartoon villain as he made his darting move forward across the road. Cliché as the mask was, though, it served its purpose well enough. Scanning the area all the while, he set off at a quiet trot up the yard of the nearest home, about 20 yards off to the side of the driveway. Bud was careful to be at least slightly inconspicuous and hug the trees and hills rather than traipsing the distance in the open, rummaging for a ring of bump keys he kept muffled in a pocket while he went. What he was about to do was a gamble, he knew, but he'd done the footwork and he felt confident he was in the money. It was the height of summer, the zenith of vacation season, and no car had come in or out of this particular house for the past 2 days. There was only one car left in the garage, and the lights left gleaming like snoozing sentinels in the windows hadn't blinked on or off once during his nighttime strolls through the pastures to watch the homes. This place had all the hallmarks of being shuttered up for a week or two while the family was out cruising the distant coast or drinking on a lake, and Bud wasn't about to pass up the opportunity. The side of the sprawling house was well landscaped, which effectively meant that it was easy to approach while remaining obscured by trimmed shrubs and trees as Bud made his final approach. It was under cover of these shadows that he skulked towards the patio door, which opened into the basement of the home. A pool lay off to the side of the house, its noisy filter humming in the dark, and the furniture lining the porch reeked of money. The people who owned this place were loaded, but he'd spotted no proud declarations of security in the yard, nor had he spotted any stickers along the windows of the house which spoke to modern security systems. If they realized how vulnerable their home was out here away from town and nestled in rolling fields, the residents certainly cared little as far as Bud could tell. Their carelessness was his gain, he supposed. With a few careful strides forward, he reached the door, a windowed affair with most of the surface being glass, and looked inside. The basement was as it had been on earlier silent visits to the home during his period of observation, which was to say it was dark, still, and empty. It was certainly no working-class basement, though, for there were grandiose hardwood floors and nice leather furniture pieces studding the lounge-like room, he observed. A flat screen decorated the far wall next to a door which led out into a hallway, That, along with the televisions which seemed to dot every other visible room in the house, told him this place was probably stacked with easy items, and though he wouldn't be dragging all the flat screens and computers out with him, he could probably load up on laptops or tablets here, along with other things. Perhaps he'd get lucky and find a gun safe or some stash of money not trusted to banks. They'd likely have plenty of jewelry, and though Bud had no eye for the stuff himself, the house struck him as the sort which might just have a piece or two of valuable artwork displayed somewhere on the walls. He knew fences and pawn shops which wouldn't bat an eye at such items across state lines, and he was already cataloging what was and wasn't worth taking. That left him to mentally prepare for the risky yet exhilarating job of moving the stuff to his car down the road, as he slipped free his screwdriver and brought his bump keys to bear. He checked the sprawling, empty yard behind him once more to ensure it was deserted, a force of stubborn habit for which he chided himself, before jiggling the proper key into the hole and readying his improvised hammer. He carried picks for more subtle operations, but bump keys suited him just fine. Their brutish triggering strategy of simply knocking pins out of the way was hard to fuck up, and he didn't need any delicacy or precision to use them. They were loud, sure, but they were also fast, and if there was one thing time had taught Bud, it was that time was the main factor in any successful wrongdoing. Every minute he lingered up here, with his car brooding back along the dark road, was another in which something could go wrong. A farmer roused in the night across the way might see his car near their pasturage, or a cop driving home after a late call might notice the glint of lights being turned on in a house he knew to be empty. An insomniac neighbor might catch a hint of movement in the next yard over through the trees, as Bud carried a load of valuables down to the wooded roadside and come to check things out. Seconds counted, and the less he wasted, the fewer risks he ran along the way. He tapped the end of the key hard with his screwdriver-turned bump hammer, and though the first try did not get him through, the second try was better paced, allowing him to turn the lock and slide the door gently open. Silence ensued as Bud slipped in over the threshold and listened cautiously for any disturbance upstairs, his ears honed by practice and a healthy thieve's dosage of paranoia. No steps creaked on the floors above that he could distinguish, and he heard no siren or automated cry of an alarm being triggered. He'd have to be careful to keep an eye on the front drive to ensure a silent alarm hadn't alerted authorities, but most security services would have called and woken up the occupants by the time 30 seconds had passed, if that had been the case. He hung still as statuary, and he'd heard nothing after a full minute scouring the quiet air. Still, caution didn't hurt, and it was with ample care that he crept forward towards the hall, leaving the door open behind him, just in case he needed to slip away fast into the shadowy pastures stretching off behind the property. The walls were studded with framed family pictures and vacation shots which the darkness forged into impenetrable jumbles of shapes and edges. Though his flashlight was on, Bud kept it pointed towards the ground, never wishing to alert any who might happen to look up at the house from outside. That was just the kind of luck he'd sometimes had, his first forays into a house or easily cracked garage revealed by some night owl just as shocked to spot him as he was to be spotted. Those were the kinds of situations which got you caught, or worse, and it was vital he never assume anything when entering such a potentially dangerous environment. The doorway into the hall was open, but the hall itself, which led around to what Bud assumed to be the path upstairs, was tight. Not that it was designed to be constricting, but it had been lined on one side by 2 long antique wooden benches, with closed doors set into the opposite wall. They apparently saw more use as shelves than seating arrangements, and were cluttered with discarded books and a few game cases. though Bud spotted nothing of immediate value there amongst the jumble. He began down the hall on quiet feet, coming to a halt just before the first door. With his light leading the way, he peeked in. The handle and hinges were surprisingly void of the normal groans and squeals which all too often accompanied the opening of interior doors, but any relief Bud felt was quickly dispelled when he saw that the room contained only an assortment of plastic toys and brightly colored childish refuse. Their chromatic sheen in the dark told him all he needed to know, and he slid the door back into the frame with a silent shake of his head. There was nothing good to be found in playrooms. The second room yielded little more, turning out to be a bathroom sporting a wide closet and shower. While both rooms were large and well cared for in their way, their contents weren't what he'd come here for. Bud found himself eager to ascend the stairs to the upper floors, certain this palace amongst the hills and streams hid some treasure to offer up to him. Rounding the corner out of the hall, he tested the first step for creaks and, finding it steady, pressed on. Stairs were always a problem in older or more cheaply constructed houses, but a silent lurker didn't have to think twice here to keep their noise to a minimum. Sturdy construction was almost a greater blessing to an intruder than it was to a homeowner, so long as the intruder in question knew their business. When Bud hit the door, topping the stairway in the near blackness, and found it unbarred and easily opened, with no clatter to announce his presence, he cheered himself in silence, grinning beneath his mask. Here, he'd caught his first glimpse of payday. A pair of laptops, fairly recent by the looks of them, were stacked atop the arm of a leather couch in a large room centered by a wide coffee table and television. The fact that the main floor's ceiling was so open and this living room area was so visible grated on him, as did the fact that the doors connected to it were closed and potentially guarding occupied bedrooms. Bud was too far in to step back now, though, and his pride, along with the next month's expenses, demanded he push on. Navigating carefully across the hardwood floor and making hardly a sound, he slipped open his backpack inch by muffled inch until he could finally fit the paired laptops in. Cautiously unwinding and coiling their chargers, these went into the bag as well, still yawning hungry for more plunder. Bud scored a charging tablet beneath the tall, curtained windows which formed the outer wall of the room, and due to the low light from several decorative lamps, he was blessed with the ability to navigate the place without a flashlight. Weaving around several chairs, he approached two doors which sat before and to the right of the basement's exit. Here, on light feet, he halted, for he needed to know what lay within before he continued. Empty as the house seemed, it didn't hurt to take precautions. No snores or voices had reached him as he'd slunk through the living room, and it was only now in the afterglow of a minor score that Bud realized how deep the silence about him was. It wasn't just the lack of people or pets, he reasoned. No obvious humming of appliances or creaking of sturdy timbers reached his ears. Strange, even in a newer house like this one. A minute spent listening for noises which never sounded near those two gloating, pale doors in the shadow drove him to check the one on his right to find another bathroom. His attention fell back to the other passage into places unknown. Silence still reigned all about him, and feeling anxious, perhaps even reckless, he gripped the handle and pushed the thing wide. Inside, there were a great many shadows and silhouettes, but Bud had his light in hand, and was not convinced anyone unaware and ready to be disturbed was in the room. If there were residents here, they'd have to be waiting for him after some unknown signal that he'd gotten in. That was silly to consider, even in the midst of all that gaping silence. No, Bud was ready to make a move, and with his flashlight at the ready as both a tool and a potential club, he lit up the place. An empty and ordered bed glared back at him, and the whole silent master bedroom seemed to yawn out and dare him to enter. Every dark corner was quickly revealed to be a hideaway for nothing save shadows which danced in the glow of the beam. There were finely made bedside tables or chairs, along with another goddamn flat screen. Bud hesitated, for some reason worried he'd made some mistake. Caution was no stranger to him, and though he didn't quite know why, he felt the need for it here. After another few long moments spent listening in the doorway, he pushed in, shaking loose his frigid nerves. There was no good reason to shirk good luck, after all, and he could positively smell the stink of electronics and jewelry waiting to be pawned in this eloquent little hideaway. Yet another closet and bathroom opened off the bedroom, but after a quick once-over to ensure their vacancy, Bud went for carven boxes of dark-stained wood on the room's largest dresser. Their shape screamed volumes about what awaited his prying hands inside. Only an inch or so of wood and a cheap and unlocked clasp laying between him and what just might be his favorite score of the night. Jewelry was a hit-and-miss commodity to some, but Bud had contacts who would buy it off him for distribution privately online, or at distant and none-too-clean pawnshops. If it was quality stuff, it translated quite fluently to money, and Bud could tell by the look of this collection that at least some of the residents' wealth had been invested perfectly for him. He scooped up at least 10 fragile necklaces, several pairs of earrings, and 5 or 6 rings into a pocket on his pack before tightening it up, not wishing to lose a single glinting ounce of precious cargo. One piece was remarkable, even under his harsh light. A ring sporting a black, polished orb with a hectic pattern of uneven crimson veins running through it. Gem, stone, or otherwise, he could not tell, but it glinted before his eyes, the veins seeming to ripple and shift as he twisted it around in his fingers. The dark, aged silver band was inlaid with writing in jagged characters and symbols Bud couldn't read, but they had a venerable sort of artistic delicacy to them, like classical Arabic or kanji, though this was certainly neither of those. This ring had been stored in a compartment all its own, the other pieces unworthy of its aristocratic company. Bud felt keenly that it was the most valuable thing in the collection, and he gave the small jeweler's magnum opus its own space in the inside pocket of his jacket. He plucked watches and other rings from drawers beneath the jewelry box, but none exhilarated him like the ring had. Why, beyond its obvious beauty, Bud would not have been able to say, but all the rest seemed trifles to him by comparison, and he would periodically feel the weight of the thing through his jacket as he went about his business, ensuring it was still safe. A phone, perhaps an older model abandoned for a newer trinket, was grabbed from the nearest bedside table before Bud padded back to the doorway into the living room. It was in this doorway that he was given pause for the second time on that floor. It took a moment for Bud to register why, his eyes bolting to and fro while his thoughts struggled to keep up. He realized it was a great deal darker than it had been, his flashlight suddenly needed where once the lamps had shown the way. A glance showed him the lights had indeed all gone off, and it was with some regret that he lit the place with his light, painfully aware of how visible the beam would be from the open landing of the floor above, or the wide archway that led into the kitchen across the way. No alarmed cries or sudden movements signaled he had anything to worry about. Bud was still very much alone, it seemed, but his elation had again given way to paranoia, and that was generally a good thing. He'd been stupid to ignore his unease earlier on, he thought, and though this might be a power outage, he would need to be certain. Quickly, no longer quite as cautious on the hardwood, Bud padded across the living room and into the vacant kitchen, whose wall of windows and yawning opening onto a sunroom made him nervous. Still, he didn't douse his light. It felt painfully dark in here, more so than he'd noticed at a distance wandering the adjoining living room. though the windows should have been a comfort due to the fact they opened onto the private, secluded backyard. They still bred only worry. Again, it took a moment to register why, but only a moment. Outside the sunroom's opposing windows, lighting the side of the walk which led up the house's rear wall and towards the driveway and garage, there was a row of gleaming little lantern-like landscaping lights. Bud knew well from hours of observation and several stints of nocturnal snooping that the outdoor lights were not solar-powered or battery-fed. They were connected to the house's electricity, preventing him from easily dousing them the night of his heist without committing the cardinal sin of alerting any unexpected residents still in the house, by also killing the whole place's power. Despite the darkness brooding all around him, the outdoor lights were still on. If those were still lit, the lack of power inside was not so easily shrugged off, and a quick test of the switch beside him in the kitchen produced nothing save a disappointing and confounding click. Cursing to himself and wheeling around as if he was going to catch some proud, huddled prankster behind him waiting to explain the glory of his orchestrated confusion, Bud found nothing aside from a dark and empty house, the very same one through which he'd just rushed like a novice. He sighed and collected his thoughts before forcing himself to move on. A quick scan of the kitchen and sunroom turned up $40 in a drawer and a second tablet charging on the countertop. Bud pushed out into a short hall, which led on his right into an open laundry room beside what he expected was a closet. To the left were the stairs leading up to the second floor. Ignoring the laundry room, he tried the door, and was pleased to find himself in the house's empty garage. Utterly quiet, he stepped out onto the concrete floor of the garage and brought his light about to scan for anything of note which he could safely carry out. Larger hauls, like the nice lawnmower parked against the far wall, were out of the question, but he made note of the lightly used weed-eater and chainsaw nearby, meaning to swing back through and grab them on his way out. Then, above a tool-laden workbench, he spotted another tasty morsel, and was instantly glad he'd come out here. Though their house sported no trophies and their photos spoke nothing of hunting or marksmanship, the black forms of a shotgun and 2 scoped rifles hung blatant against the wall, just waiting for Bud to come forth and seize them, which he did. He stacked them against the wall alongside the power tools for his final exit, and then crammed ammo from the shelf below them into his bag. Looking around to make certain he hadn't missed any more golden opportunities, he retreated to the house and pulled the door quietly shut behind him. Silence still reigned in here, and Bud wasn't quite comfortable with it. He proceeded upstairs, feeling the desire to escape this place even more keenly, and resolving to keep up the pace. If there were still people inside, they would likely be up here in the bedrooms, and he wanted to take suitable precautions, flicking his light off as he went. In the newly blackened house, he found himself groping a bit as he exited the stairs onto a balcony. Once he was sure there was no one to see, the flashlight came back on. Here, Bud was above the living room, which lay off to his left over a thin railing, opposite the foyer and the front door, which were off to his right over another. A second winding stairway led down to the house's front entrance from that side. Before him was a white and tiled room whose door was open, beside another door into a darker room which was harder to distinguish. Behind him and off to the right was another door which hung wide, looking in on the shape of what Bud assumed was a bed. Bud made for the one off behind him first, listening over several drawn-out seconds of approach before finally risking shining his light into the interior. He found the bed empty and room vacant. Pushing in, he noted the gaming computer resting atop a desk, which might just be valuable enough to warrant a second trip back up to the house, so he could lug the heavy thing out to the car on its own. He went for an older MP3 player atop the dresser, then found no less than $300 in a mismatched bundle of bills amongst pens and notebooks on the bedside table. Bud pocketed it and moved to the bathroom, only giving it a quick glance before moving on. There was a stack of jumbled paper on the desk beside the keyboard, something Bud only noticed after he'd rifled the drawers. The sheets were covered in odd characters, which reminded Bud's unpracticed eye of the ones on the ring he'd found downstairs, angular and staggered in peculiar vertical rows. Hundreds of pages there were, and a quick scan of the notebooks he'd passed up earlier revealed much the same in those. They'd been scrawled in a ragged hand, and the ink of whatever pen had done the scrawling was often smeared or blurred. If Bud had been paranoid before, now he was spooked. Retreating onto the landing and hearing nothing upon approaching the other rooms, Bud ignored the tiled one, which had to be another bathroom. He entered the darker doorway, mind alight with worry now despite his excitement. What he found was another empty bed, and though he scooped up an older cell phone from a chest of drawers, there was little to be had here. Just old children's sketches on the walls and the soulless paraphernalia of films and games along the walls. Then, in the closet, he found something strange. A thin door set into the rear wall, half shrouded behind hanging clothes. The walls were a bland beige, and the door had been painted identically, making it hard to spot through the jackets and trousers which obscured it. Only a thin strip of darkness along the floor beneath the clothing tipped Bud off to its presence, and the longer he looked at it, the more his unease gnawed up through his churning guts. So deep was this unease that he almost didn't open the door. Though it was probably some unfinished attic over the downstairs bedroom, or strange storage space set aside by the residents, he couldn't shake the nervous tension that had frozen him downstairs to drink in the silence, or sent him skittering out of the other bedroom after snooping through the strange writing there. There was no denying that this would be a nice place to stash old valuables, though, and his rational, overriding reasoning that there was nothing to worry about eventually won out. This door did creak, as if, Bud thought as he entered, it were older than the house which stood all around it. Shaking that ridiculous notion aside, he found himself in an attic, the far end of the room sloping with the angle of the roof. Unused furniture and larger children's toys abandoned with age sat in rows upon an unfinished plywood floor, with fully half of the big space before him left as open insulation. He strolled the dusty aisles between the discarded antiques and memories, spotting nothing of interest, swatting aside webs and stepping over suitcases and disassembled bed frames. On the outermost row of the attic's stored trove, though, he found something strange. A circuit of 6 tiny candles, all lit, burning in a ring upon the crude floor. So low were they, and so soft was the glow they put off, he hadn't even seen their flickering over the furniture as he entered the room. In fact, Bud didn't really see them until he had already stepped into the center of the circle. Immediately he began to wonder who had lit them, or what their presence meant, to reconsider each step he'd taken through the house thus far. Then, as he neared the edge of the plywood and exited the circle, where the floor tapered off to uncovered insulation, and the shadows of the unfinished space beyond grew deepest, he saw something out against the slope of the roof, hanging among the beams. It was motionless, and at first he took it to be a tool, perhaps a broom or a rake, though the reason why someone would shimmy out along the boards between the insulation to hang one there eluded him. Once his light had lingered on it, though, he saw it was a sort of life-sized figure made of wood and bundled straw. Like a crude scarecrow stripped of clothes, it had odd arms and legs of thatch, and a cylindrical body of sticks and dried, brittle grass. Its wrists and ankles tapered off into oversized, dead tree limbs, their uneven and tangled branches forming the eerie, elongated fingers and toes of the thing. It was, Bud thought, headless, but where a neck should have been, a pale ring of bony spikes thrust up from the disturbed thatch and twigs. The longer he looked, the more certain he became that these spikes were bony ribs, or teeth. That was quite enough for him, and he traced the path back out of the attic with his light never fully leaving the effigy which hung against the ceiling. Bud had felt unnerved before, of course, but given he was an intruder in a place he shouldn't be, it had always been easy to dismiss the sensation of being watched. This was different now. The only analogous feeling he could drum up from his memories being times he'd been spotted or chased off. The strange writing and intriguing ring seemed much less explicable to him now, with the shadow of the attic's strange inhabitant hanging low over his memory. What sort of person builds a thing like that? Shutting the attic door behind him and closing off the closet for good measure, he figured he was just about done with this expedition. Even if there were more money to be made, Bud felt it was far past time to make his exit. He crossed to the windows of the bedroom, which should overlook the front yard and Limestone Way beyond, thinking to take one last glimpse before he made his exit through the garage. The blinds on the forward windows were thick, and he dampened his lights as he approached them and tentatively slid a single plastic panel aside. His heart jumped. Bud pulled back from the window, sure he'd been mistaken. What he'd seen made no sense, and it made less sense the more he tried to think it over. Again he looked, and again he withdrew, something between disgust and fear welling up in him as he tried to process what he was seeing. Through the window, past the familiar front yard and the tapering driveway, the open lawn gave way, but not, as it should, to the asphalt of the road and the pastures beyond. Rather, the driveway and the grass had been eaten up by an impenetrably thick hedge of monstrous trees. They were impossibly huge, so huge that Bud had initially believed the dark row of them to be the horizon, an optical illusion in which the yard seemed to disappear into the night sky. The reality was no less strange. The trees were hundreds of feet tall, towering over the house like the redwoods one might see out west. But these were gnarled and leafy, like the twisted old oaks which sprouted here in Kentucky. Several times, Bud withdrew and went back for another look as if his vision might right itself, as if the road would come back into view. But it didn't. There came a clopping and clattering downstairs, as of old hobnailed shoes against the hardwood floors. Bud froze, his worst suspicions that the house wasn't empty suddenly made real, listening as whoever was making the noise banged about. His straining ears could not make out the exact direction in the dark and suddenly alien building. All he felt sure of was that this fumbler in the night was likely in the open foyer or living room. Bud lunged all at once after a second's timid paralysis, needing to see someone in here, even if it meant he'd be caught. The quiet, the candles, the trees. He was desperate now, really and truly frightened for the first time during his night here. He was not interested in remaining quiet and controlled now, only in getting out. Like a scene in some slipshod, churned-out horror film, he emerged with flashlight in hand to find nothing in either room as he desperately scanned the sprawl beneath both railings. Bud spat his frustrations aloud to the silent home, storming down the stairs in a rush towards the short hall and the kitchen, not wanting to risk the path to the foyer, even though there was an office and dining room still to be explored over there. His theft was done. He didn't want to get any closer to the forward windows than he needed to, lest he get another look at those trees in the front yard through their horribly broad, open panes. His only thoughts were of escape. Into the kitchen Bud went, though he thought it even darker in there this time around. Just as he thought better of trying, he found his eyes wandering to the sunroom's nearby windows, their brief sweep showing him all he needed to see of the gigantic trees which had swallowed up the backyard, the walkway, and the exterior lights. Had it not been clear just moments before? A worthless question, he knew. Something was going on out there, and it was nothing he wanted to be a part of. In the face of the trees, Bud nearly reconsidered his impulse to leave the house, right up until a crash upstairs sent him skittering back to the garage door. His thoughts always on the hanging figure in the attic, he ducked out and grabbed the shotgun he'd propped against the wall before running towards the exterior door that opened onto the driveway. Even through the noise of his heavy footfalls and labored breathing, he could hear the thump of steps descending the stairway as he pushed outside into the muggy, still, silent night. No bugs droned and no animals called, and the trees which he'd seen from within were all too real in the soft light of the clear nocturnal sky. The moon and most of the stars had been swallowed up by the towering, impenetrable canopy of trees, which hung still and unmoved by wind or birds in their boughs. Their mighty roots ruptured the driveway in places, and they seemed to lean in overhead as if peeking for the windows. Again, Bud was jolted into motion by the sound of something behind him in the garage, heavy and purposeful, a low scrabbling on the concrete floor. Clutching the shotgun like a lifeline, Bud fled through grass the height of first his knees, then his waist, making for what should have been the road, uncertain of anything anymore. Saplings and scrub bushes, along with the grass, had thrust up through the now aged and cracked driveway, and the whole mess loomed up out of the darkness around him as he ran. Into the tangle he went, leaping what thorns and branches he could and plunging at length into the forest which had so unthinkably crept up on this house, amongst empty fields and hills, whose canopy would shame the Amazon. It was beneath that canopy that noise returned. First his own frantic run in the dark, then the noises of other things, large and cumbersome, groaning and cracking and stomping in the black labyrinth of branches and titan roots. Escape crowded out any thought as Bud tried to weave in the direction of what should lead him back towards what had once been the road and his waiting car, but he had no way of knowing that he was going in the right direction. The knobs of swollen, damp wood and churned, leafy mud which surrounded him made it impossible to see for more than a few yards in any given direction, and he spent as much time clambering over or under roots or squeezing between the monolithic trunks of the titan trees as he did truly running. It wasn't even certain the car or the road were there in this nightmarish dreamscape, but Bud, to his credit, did not ever allow himself to think those thoughts. For him, there was only escape. So it was for a minute or two, the pounding of his feet, sloshing of mud, and snapping of branches in this tenebrous jungle leaving Bud mentally numb. He tripped over vine-like jumbles of thorns and fell against the bark walls of trunks and roots which crowded in against one another. His light played off dark shapes which lurched backward into burrows and skittered noisily up into the leaves overhead, and he scented the rotten miasma of bogs and death and wet fur on the tepid air. The activity only grew greater as the time wore on. Never did he truly see anything, but always the heavy footfalls and snorts and braying bleats of things beyond his vision in the trees drove him on. On more than one occasion, the canopy overhead shook along with the sounds, the whole of the forest bending as mountainous things lost to Bud amongst the wood moved through the trees like children through shrubs. Gigantic trunks would bend and snap and fall, their deaths lost immediately in the thrumming chaos of the teeming woodland. The tread of these things shook the earth, but they never stopped or searched. Bud got the impression that they were too large to be seen from down here. Cyclopean beings striding through brush like he'd stride through a field of wheat, unconcerned with the insignificant things which skittered around their unseen ankles down below. There were other things to worry about down here. Many-legged, chitinous things the length of an arm, which struck for him in silence as he jumped over tangled roots, or dark, winged things which swooped low overhead as if to pluck him from the ground. There was nothing which didn't seem to breathe and seethe and hunt in this eldritch forest. Even the bark of the great trees rippled occasionally beneath his hands as he climbed over roots, shivering like skin at his unexpected touch. Once he felt certain a crook between those roots had attempted to close on him like an oaken mouth as he slid through it, sending him sprinting away through the undergrowth. Beetle-like creatures the size of his fist marched in rows down the furrows in the bark, hauling giant, drooping leaves from above, and they shrieked in almost human voices when touched. Hairless pink sloths with black veins and blacker eyes hung from trees and watched his progress along the forest floor, loose skin hanging in drapes from their limbs. Vast claws thrust up from the nooks beneath the undergrowth to snatch at pale deer with too many sets of legs, and the faintly glowing heads of gibbous flowers seemed to turn to follow him as he fled through the shadows. And all the while, a pursuer thundered unseen through the woods, sometimes behind and sometimes before, turning Bud's escape into a wheeling panoply of turns and retreats as he rounded trunks and climbed furrows in the rotten dirt. Only occasionally did he spot something terrible, tall and willowy, loping along in the distance behind intervening branches and scrub. The shape in the trees snorted like a buck, giving warning, though this was deeper and far more off-putting than that. Several times Bud came close to taking a shot at it with the gun he carried, but it was always on the move, and seemed to titter and flee when he took notice of it. Then, as he fell back to flight, it would creep up and pursue again, beginning the whole cycle anew. Who could say how long the chase went on? Certainly not Bud. Time seemed ephemeral to him, as it would in sleep, and though he felt it dragged for hours, it could as easily have been days. No sun, after all, could penetrate so unwholesome and perfidious a canopy as the one which reared up overhead, no matter how bright. Whole seasons might pass, and still the Stygian, dank bowels of this lunatic woodland would brood unaffected, sealed off from the trivial goings-on of the world beyond. At last he emerged into a small clearing between a circuit of particularly heinous trunks, and had to stop in place to be sure of what he saw. It was his car, aged and rusting, but still sporting the shitty rattle-can paint job and bent front bumper. A ring of half-rotten, hubcap-sized toadstools grew in a perfect circle all around it, and its flattened wheels had been swallowed long ago by black and fly-haunted mud. A shape reared up from where it had crouched behind the battered vehicle, causing Bud to drop the light and pull the trigger of his shotgun. But the thing was unloaded, and it clicked like a spent toy in his vice-tight grip. In all his frantic sprinting and scrambling, he'd never once allowed himself to consider it might be empty. The thing which slid into the open in the ambient glow of his discarded light was limber, heavy, and huge. So huge Bud imagined it must have been buried in mud to have fit behind the car. Its thin, bristling midriff swayed and bent like a young tree bends in the wind, and the 100 fingers of its gnarled wooden hands writhed like coiling serpents. Its bark-coated legs were stone still as it moved, for beneath them, feet which seemed to be tree branches twitched and skittered like the countless limbs of crabs or spiders to bear its hefty form across the mud. Bud realized in that moment that it was the effigy he'd seen in the attic made whole, far larger than the crude, dead mockery the blasted family in that awful house had hung up to honor it, As it came nearer to him, it bent low at the waist, and the space where its neck should be sunk into view. A great leech's mouth of shifting bone and rippling wood which snorted hot air as it came face to face with the cowering thief over which it loomed. Sudden as the reflex to fire had come, Bud's mind was consumed by the image of the strange ring which even now hung heavy in the pocket of his jacket. He plucked it from the pocket, holding it aloft before the living effigy, gazing deep into the play of his dropped flashlight off the black stone and its strange red veins, and the churning mouth beyond it. The thing's tendril-like fingers embraced him like snaring vines, supple and gentle. Thankful, Bud dared to hope. Holding him steady, the thing leaned in and ate him, ring and all.